The paralysis had already seized my legs, creating a sensation like cold concrete pouring through my veins. And as I lay on the damp floor of the warehouse staring up at the leaking roof, I realized the killer wasn't going to shoot me. He was simply going to touch me one last time and watch my own nervous system betray me. Before we rewind to the rainy Seattle night where this nightmare began, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because you won't want to miss the details of a case that made the FBI rewrite their profiling manuals. It started on a Tuesday, the kind of Tuesday that feels like a Monday dragged through the mud. Seattle was living up to its reputation, a relentless drizzle sheeting off the windows of the 3rd Precinct. I was nursing a lukewarm coffee, staring at the pile of paperwork on my desk, when the phone rang. It wasn't the frantic ring of a robbery in progress or the sharp tone of a domestic disturbance. It was the heavy, rhythmic ring of the sheriff's direct line. Sheriff Miller didn't call detectives at 2 a.m. unless the situation was FUBAR, fouled up beyond all recognition. I picked up, the plastic receiver cold against my ear. Miller's voice was gravel, worn down by 30 years on the force. He told me to get to Discovery Park immediately. He didn't say it was a murder. He said it was a tableau. That word alone sent a shiver down my spine that had nothing to do with the precinct's failing heating system. I arrived at the scene 20 minutes later. The blue and red lights of the cruisers were fracturing in the mist, painting the dripping pine trees in strobe light strokes. The perimeter was already established, yellow tape sagging under the weight of the rain. Officer Reynolds was at the log, looking paler than usual. He lifted the tape for me without a word, his gaze fixed on the ground. I walked down the muddy trail, my boots squelching in the muck, toward the bluff overlooking the Puget Sound. The wind was whipping off the water, carrying the smell of salt and ozone, but as I got closer to the cluster of CSI technicians, a different smell hit me. It was faint, sweet, like almond blossoms rotting in the heat. The victim was a woman, mid-30s, dressed in high-end running gear. She wasn't lying on the ground. She was seated on a park bench, facing the ocean. If you viewed her from a distance, you'd think she was just resting, maybe contemplating the dark water. But up close, the horror of the tableau became clear. Her hands were clamped tight over her own eyes, fingers interlocked so fiercely that the knuckles were white, devoid of blood. Her mouth was open in a silent scream, but her body was rigid, unnaturally so. It wasn't rigor mortis, the timeline was too short. She looked like she had been turned to stone in the middle of a terrified gasp. Detective Thorne, the medical examiner, Dr. Eris Thorne, no relation, just a confusing coincidence we'd lived with for years, stepped back from the body. He snapped his latex gloves, his face grim under the portable floodlights. I've never seen lividity present like this. It's patchy, and there's no external trauma. No gunshot, no knife wounds, no ligature marks on the neck. I leaned in, careful not to disturb the scene. The rain was beating on her windbreaker. Heart attack, I asked, though I knew the answer. With her hands glued to her face like that, Eris shook his head. This was induced. Look at the wrists. I shined my flashlight. The skin on her wrists was irritated, red and blistering, but in a perfect geometric pattern. It looked like she had been grabbed, but the burn wasn't from friction. It was chemical. He touched her, I whispered. He touched her, and she froze. We identified her as Sarah Jenkins, a senior analyst at a tech firm downtown. Single, successful, no criminal record. Her life was digital, clean, and by all accounts, safe. We pulled her phone records and credit card statements immediately. The last transaction was at a coffee shop 3 miles away at 6 p.m. The ME put time of death around 8 p.m., 2 hours unaccounted for. The autopsy the next day deepened the mystery. Eris called me down to the morgue, the air smelling of antiseptic and steel. It's a cocktail, he said, pointing to the toxicology report on his screen. Tetrodotoxin, pufferfish poison, mixed with a high concentration of DMSO, dimethyl sulfide. It's a solvent. It allows the poison to pass through the skin instantly upon contact. I felt the blood drain from my face. So he didn't inject her? No, Eris said, looking at the body on the slab. He coated his gloves in it. He grabbed her wrists. The DMSO carried the neurotoxin straight into her bloodstream. Paralysis would have been near instantaneous, starting at the extremities and moving inward. But here's the kicker, Thorne. He didn't give her enough to kill her immediately. She suffocated because her diaphragm paralyzed hours later. She was fully conscious, unable to move, trapped in her own body while she sat on that bench. The cruelty was breathable. It wasn't just murder, it was torture via deprivation. The killer wanted her to feel the loss of control. The touch of horror wasn't the death itself, it was the terrifying intimacy of the delivery method. We had to keep the specific method, the contact poison, out of the press. If the public knew you could die just by someone grabbing your arm, Seattle would descend into panic. We released a statement saying we were investigating a suspicious death and left it at that, but the media sharks smelled blood. Back at the precinct, the bullpen was buzzing. We put Sarah's life on the whiteboard. Suspects. The ex-boyfriend, Mark, who had sent a few angry texts 6 months ago. We brought him in. He was a barista, terrified, shaking in the interrogation room. He lawyered up immediately, but his alibi held water. He was on a live stream playing video games with 300 witnesses. We cut him loose. Then came the second victim. 3 days later, an alleyway behind a jazz club in Pioneer Square. The setting was different. Urban, gritty, smelling of stale beer and exhaust, but the signature was identical. A young man, barely 22. He was propped up against the brick wall, legs crossed casually, but his hands were clamped over his ears, pressing hard. "See no evil, hear no evil," I muttered, staring at the body. The blistering on his wrists was the same, the chemical burn. The killer was escalating, or perhaps completing a set. This victim was Julian Vane, a music student. Sarah Jenkins was a tech analyst. What was the connection? We ran their lives through the databases. NCIC, local traffic cams, financial records, nothing overlapped. They didn't go to the same gym, didn't shop at the same stores, didn't swipe right on the same apps. I sat at my desk, rubbing my temples, the fluorescent lights humming a headache into my skull. My partner, Detective Rodriguez, dropped a file on my desk. "I found something weird, Thorne. Look at their medical history." I opened the files. Sarah had a history of migraines. Julian had tinnitus. Common enough. "Look at the treatments." Rodriguez pointed a thick finger at the pages. Both of them were seeing specialists for sensory issues. Sarah for light sensitivity, Julian for sound. "Different doctors?" I asked. "Different doctors, different clinics, but," Rodriguez paused for effect, "both clinics are owned by the same parent company, Sensory Omnicorp. And guess what? They just opened a new experimental treatment center in Belltown called the Haptic Lab." It was a thin lead, but in a case with no DNA and no witnesses, thin was all we had. We drove to the Haptic Lab. It was a sterile, minimalist building, all glass and brushed steel. The rain smeared the windows, making the people inside look like ghosts. The receptionist was polished, smiling with too many teeth. We showed our badges. "We need to speak to the director," I said. Dr. Elias Thorne, again, the name irony wasn't lost on me, but it's a common name in these parts, was a man who looked like he'd been scrubbed with bleach. Pale skin, bald head, intense blue eyes behind rimless glasses. He invited us into his office, which smelled faintly of lavender and ozone. "Detectives," he said, not offering a hand. He kept his hands folded on the glass desk. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "We're investigating the deaths of Sarah Jenkins and Julian Vane," I said, watching his micro-expressions. "Both were patients at clinics owned by your company." Dr. Thorne didn't blink. "We treat thousands of patients across the Pacific Northwest. Statistical probability suggests some will meet unfortunate ends." "These weren't accidents," Rodriguez said, leaning forward. "They were murdered with a very specific neurotoxin. one that requires a deep understanding of the nervous system. Dr. Thorne smiled, a cold, clinical stretching of lips. I am a neurologist, detective. I understand the nervous system better than anyone. If I wanted to kill someone, I wouldn't leave a trail leading back to my corporation. I would simply turn off their autonomic functions and call it an aneurysm. He was arrogant, narcissistic, but was he a killer? We pressed him on his staff, his access to chemicals. He gave us the runaround, hiding behind HIPAA laws and corporate lawyers. We left with a list of employees, but a bad taste in our mouths. He's good for it, Rodriguez said, as we got back in the unmarked Ford. He looks at people like they're lab rats. He's too clean, I countered. He's the CEO. He doesn't get his hands dirty. He hires people. We dug into the employee list. Nurses, therapists, janitors, background checks on everyone. It was a slow, grinding process. The days turned into a week. The city was on edge. A leak at the coroner's office had hinted at the paralysis aspect, and people were looking at strangers with suspicion. Then the break came from an unexpected place, the toxicology lab. Eris called me at 6 a.m. Thorne, I found something else in the chemical burn on the second victim. It wasn't just the toxin. There were microscopic particulates embedded in the skin lesions. Clay. Clay? Kaolin, to be precise. High-grade porcelain clay, the kind used for fine sculpting. I stared at the wall of my apartment, coffee mug in hand. A sculptor? A potter? Sarah had her hands over her eyes, Julian over his ears. It's artistic. It's a pose. I went back to the employee list from the haptic lab. I wasn't looking for doctors anymore. I was looking for someone who worked with their hands. I scanned the names, cross-referencing them with art schools or studios. And there it was. Arthur Pym, listed as a therapeutic technician, basically a masseur, but his background check showed a gap of 4 years. Before that, he was a student at the Seattle Academy of Fine Arts. Major? Sculpture. I pulled his file. Pym had been expelled. The reason listed? Inappropriate conduct involving models. We dug deeper. Pym lived in a basement apartment in Fremont. We got a warrant. The judge signed it after seeing the clay connection. We assembled the tactical team. We weren't taking chances with a guy who could kill you with a touch. Hazmat suits were discussed, but we settled on full tactical gear with zero exposed skin. Gloves taped to sleeves, balaclavas. We hit the apartment at noon. The door crashed inward with a battering ram. Police, search warrant. The apartment was empty, but it was a house of horrors. The walls were covered in sketches. Sketches of people in agony. Sketches of Sarah. Sketches of Julian. And a third sketch, a woman with her hands over her mouth. Speak no evil, I realized. He's going for the trifecta, Rodriguez said, his voice muffled by his tactical mask. We found a workbench in the corner, bags of kaolin clay, vials of liquid that the hazmat team confirmed was the tetrodotoxin mix. But we also found a calendar. Today's date was circled, and a location, Pike Place Market. The third victim, I said, checking my watch. It was 12:30. Lunch rush, the busiest place in the city. He's going to do it in public. We scrambled. Sirens wailed as we tore through the rain-slicked streets toward the market. I got on the radio, coordinating with uniformed officers to lock down the perimeter. But Pike Place is a labyrinth of tourists, fishmongers, and flower stalls. It's a nightmare to secure. I had the sketch of the third victim on my phone. We had identified her from the haptic lab patient list based on Pym's notes found in the apartment. Emily Dow, a speech pathologist. Speak no evil. She works at a clinic on First Avenue, Rodriguez shouted over the siren. She takes her lunch break at the market. We abandoned the car at the entrance and ran. The smell of fish and wet pavement was overwhelming. The crowd was a sea of umbrellas. I scanned faces, heart hammering against my ribs. There, Rodriguez pointed. Emily Dow was standing by a flower stall, buying tulips. She was laughing, talking to the vendor. And walking toward her, moving against the flow of the crowd like a shark through water, was a man in a gray hoodie. He wore black leather gloves. Arthur Pym. He wasn't running.
He was walking with purpose. He reached out, his hand extending toward her arm. "Police, drop it!" I screamed, drawing my weapon. The crowd screamed. People dove for cover. Pim froze. He looked at me, his eyes dead and hollow. He was 10 feet from Emily. She turned, confused, seeing the gun, seeing the man reaching for her. Pim didn't surrender. He lunged. He wasn't lunging for Emily. He was lunging for a tourist, a random woman standing next to him. He was going to touch anyone he could. I fired. The shot hit Pim in the shoulder. He spun, stumbling back. He fell against a crate of apples, his gloved hand flailing. He tried to get up, his other hand reaching for his pocket, perhaps for a weapon, perhaps for a vial. Rodriguez tackled him from the blind side. It was a risky move. If Pim touched Rodriguez's neck, "Don't touch his gloves," I roared, sprinting forward. We pinned him. Rodriguez had his knee on Pim's back, keeping the gloved hands pressed into the wet pavement. Pim was laughing, a wet, gurgling laugh. "It's art," he wheezed. "It's the only way to make them stop moving, to make them perfect." We dragged him up, stripping the gloves off with pliers, bagging them instantly. The paramedics arrived for his shoulder wound, but we kept him handcuffed to the stretcher. The interrogation of Arthur Pym was chilling. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He wanted to talk about his work. He believed that the human body was imperfect because it moved, because it twitched. The sensory Omnicorp clinics were his hunting ground because the people there were already trying to fix their senses. He wanted to fix them permanently. He used the clay dust to mark them, a signature for the art world he felt rejected by. We thought it was over. Pym was in custody. The DA was preparing a case for capital punishment. But remember the start of this story? The warehouse? 2 weeks after the arrest, I received a text. It was from an unknown number. It was a photo of my daughter's school. The text read, "The artist has an apprentice." Panic, cold and sharp, pierced my chest. I called my wife. No answer. I called the school. They said my wife had picked up our daughter early. I tracked my wife's phone. It pinged at an old industrial park on the outskirts of the city, a defunct shipping warehouse. I didn't wait for backup. I know, procedure says wait, but this was my family. I drove like a madman, drifting corners, running red lights. I arrived at the warehouse. The rusty doors were ajar. It was pitch black inside. I drew my weapon, flashlight in my left hand. "Elena!" I shouted. "Maya!" Silence. Just the drip, drip, drip of water. I moved deeper into the darkness. I saw a chair in the center of the room. My wife, Alina, was tied to it. She was conscious, eyes wide with terror. Her mouth was taped shut. I rushed forward. "I've got you," I said, holstering my gun to untie her. As I reached for the ropes, Elena shook her head violently. She was trying to scream behind the tape. She was looking behind me. I spun around. A figure emerged from the shadows. It wasn't Pym. It was Dr. Elias Thorne, the CEO. Pym was a talented sculptor, Thorne said, his voice smooth, echoing in the vast space. He held a syringe gun, not a contact poison this time, but a tranquilizer. But he lacked vision. He only wanted to stop the movement. I want to study the moment the mind realizes the body is gone. "You were partners," I realized, raising my gun. Partners? No. I was the patron. He was the hands. But now I have to clean up his loose ends. He fired the tranquilizer. I dodged, the dart pinging off a metal pillar. I fired back, but he ducked behind a stack of pallets. I moved to flank him. "It's over, Thorne. The FBI is on their way." "Are they?" Thorne's voice drifted from the left. I moved right, keeping my eyes peeling. Then I felt it, a brush against my neck. I hadn't seen him circle back. He was fast. He hadn't used the tranquilizer gun. He had used his hand, a gloved hand. I spun and fired, catching him in the leg. He collapsed, screaming, but the sensation in my neck was already changing. It wasn't pain, it was absence. The cold, concrete feeling I described earlier. It started at my neck and flowed down my spine. My legs gave out. I hit the floor. My gun skittered away. Thorne was dragging himself toward me, bleeding, a manic grin on his face. The transdermal loop.
I improved the formula. Faster absorption. I couldn't move my legs. I couldn't move my arms. My chest felt like it was being crushed by a hydraulic press. I could only move my eyes. I looked at Elena. She was crying, struggling against the ropes. Thorne loomed over me. "You're going to be a masterpiece, detective." He reached for my face, intending to close my eyes, to pose me. But he had made a mistake. He had shot me with a gaze of arrogance, but he forgot about the environment. The warehouse floor was covered in water, leaking from the roof, and near my paralyzed hand, barely an inch away, lay my taser. It had fallen from my belt when I hit the ground. I couldn't grab it. My fingers were dead. But I could roll, just a fraction. My core muscles were the last to go. With a grunt that never made it past my lips, I twisted my torso. My hip nudged the taser. It slid across the wet concrete. It slid right into a puddle. The same puddle Thorne was dragging his wounded leg through. The water conducted the charge. Thorne convulsed. His eyes rolled back. The shock seized his muscles, locking him in a rigid spasm. He collapsed face first into the water, twitching. The sound of sirens finally cut through the air. I lay there, the poison warring with my system, staring at the ceiling. I couldn't blink. I couldn't breathe. The darkness was closing in. The last thing I felt was the vibration of footsteps, the SWAT team rushing in. I woke up 3 days later in the ICU. They had administered the antidote just in time. The paralysis was temporary, but the psychological scars, those don't fade. Dr. Thorne survived the shock, but suffered permanent nerve damage. He's in a maximum security prison hospital now, paralyzed from the waist down. Irony has a sick sense of humor. Pym is on death row. I'm back on the force now, but things are different. I wear gloves, always, even in the summer. I don't shake hands. When I interview a suspect, I sit a little further back, because I know now that the most terrifying weapon isn't a gun or a knife. It's the human touch. It's the realization that the barrier between you and death is as thin as a layer of skin. Every time it rains in Seattle, I feel a phantom coldness in my legs. I look at my hands, and I remember the sculptures. The hands over the eyes, the hands over the ears. And I wonder, are we all just statues waiting for the right artist to freeze us in place? What do you think? Was Dr. Thorne truly the mastermind? Or was he just another victim of his own obsession with the perfect nervous system? And could you trust a doctor after hearing this? If this story sent a chill down your spine, hit that like button. It helps the channel more than you know. And tell me in the comments, what is the one sense you would be most terrified to lose? I'll be reading your theories. Stay safe and keep your hands to yourself.